cabling issues today. Can you turn on the sound? So I also have just a quick thank you of a couple of people. Thanks so much. Specifically, our JCP team today is Chloe and Zandile. That's doing great. Okay. The first thank you goes out to all of you who made your way here today and was willing to bear with us with our delicious coffees and scones. I think it was about a year into the pandemic after our millionth online conference when Prof LaRue and I were in a Zoom call, and I very emotionally said, I miss being in a room with smart people. And today I get to be in a room with smart people, and it's all of you, and I appreciate you being here so much. I would also like to thank our community partner, Bridge Books, who do absolutely incredible work in the community here, developing the literary district of Johannesburg. We will be having our tour with them tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, starting here from the Rand Club. It's about 2.5 hours, and it's a walking tour of underground booksellers and literary historic sites in Johannesburg. And Griffin Shea, who's not here, will be taking us on that. But Miles, who is right there, is also from Bridge Books, and they've been doing all the setup for us today. They also have a sales table outside with a selection of books from Wits Press that relate to the conference. And if you buy through our community partner, you get 10% discount. Support local publishing, especially scholarly, and support local bookselling. You can support our local bookseller here outside or just around the corner is where their shop is. And it's quite lovely and beautiful. I do encourage you to take a turn there. Our coffees and scones this morning are from Wits Press, and I would like to thank them for sponsoring that. And also just for being so warm and welcoming to the fresh meat at the publishing department. I think I had a bit of shell shock coming from an engineering faculty into humanities, and I have just been made to feel so welcome. And it has been incredible getting to know you. To the School of Literature, Language and Media and my head of school, Prof Dan Ojwang, who is here today, for funding the travel for our speakers today to be here in person, as well as the incidentals and the tours for tomorrow was also paid by the school. I think it's significant that I was there for about 2 weeks when I said, I would like to have a conference. I would like money, please. And they said, yes, this sounds amazing. Here you go. They really are quite empowering of academics, and I'm very appreciative of that. For Professor Beth LaRue and her Newton Development Grant, for paying for our delicious lunch, which is later today. We'll be circulating menus for you to make your selection in a little bit. The venue is just printing them. My archives who are here today, thank you so much, Gabrielle. Lufunu couldn't make it, but I believe Daniel is here. The archivists are all here, and you're welcome to speak to them while they are here. It has been so great to get the knowledge of the archives outside of the academy and make it more available like just to normal people. And I know the Wits Historical Papers is doing a lot of work with community activists as well in researching through archives. My co-organizers, Professor LaRue and Professor Davies, whose absence here today is felt very keenly, and we hope that you can join us for the next year. I've been organizing these with Prof LaRue for about 7 years now, and they make such an effort to involve students and to involve younger academics in organizing these and in getting exposure to this kind of environment. So it started with me, and now my wonderful colleague, Anna Canal at UP has been taking over that organization. This is a completely accessible conference. We do aim to be completely accessible. We are uploading all of our recorded talks onto YouTube after the conference. And of course, YouTube has all the accessibility features. In the spirit of accessibility, we have designated a quiet space, which is the Rhodes Room, which is just around the corner here. We ask that if you need time to withdraw or if you need to isolate a little bit, you're welcome to use that room. Please respect the quiet room and socialize in the common areas outside of that. And then I just wanted to say something very brief about my new home at the school at Wits. So the school was originally founded in 1922 as the Transvaal Technical Institute, and the school itself was opened in 1935 by Dr. Vilakazi. I think this morning when I woke up in the city, the noise and the hustle and the bustle and just the people makes it feel a little bit like it's still mining, which is the original intent of the school. But I think more and more we are learning that the richness of Africa is not in our resources, but in our people and in our storytellers. And the papers yesterday, I think, spoke specifically to me. When you talk about Cantemba, I did practice this, Dumbatso Marakecha, and my new hero, Noni Jabavu. It is those accidental, incidental, and unintentional records that we manage to preserve about our storytellers that help us understand how we tell stories and understand our heritage. Today's program, I hope, will continue on this trend, and we are starting with an incredible paper by Prof Hofmeyr, which I wrote a separate introduction for. And I don't know if you drove in today, you saw giant billboards by the side of the highway. Wits University is 100 years old, in case you didn't notice. That also means that Wits Press is 100 years old. And I have the privilege today of welcoming their publisher, Veronica Klipp, twice. Her paper will be in the panel, and she just wants to say a few brief words about publishing for 100 years in the City of Gold. So, Veronica? Yeah. Are you good?
Okay, thanks, Karina. Karina always makes sure our name is very prominently displayed, which is great. Thanks very much, Letitia, and thanks to the organizers of this conference. It seemed a perfect opportunity to sort of celebrate Wits Press in a way, because as Letitia was saying, the press was actually started in March 1922, which is the same month the Wits University was officially inaugurated as a university. And that makes it the oldest university press in the country. The first Senate meeting that was held on the 22nd of March, in fact, 1922, a proposal was made to the then principal, Jan Hofmeyr, to establish a university press. And this proposal was accepted. And I think by now you all know the first book that was published. It had actually been in process before then, called The National Resources of South Africa. The journal Bantu Studies had already been published from 1921 by the College of Education, which was one of the roots of the university. But so the press has always been very closely linked to the university's history as well. And as we know, they came out of mining. A lot of the research originated in mining, things like archaeology, anthropology, paleoanthropology were a result of that. I mean, the limestone, they needed limestone to extract the gold. And in the limestone, fossils were found. And that's in fact how the focus at Wits on paleoanthropology started. So for the press from the beginning, it modeled itself on a British model, in fact, on Oxford University Press. So they established a publications committee early on. They established a form of peer review very early on, in fact, 1925. And any manuscripts that were submitted from the university had to be vetted by this publications committee, their records of readers. So we've been doing a lot of research into our own archives this year, and it's just fascinating the kind of information that's coming out of there. So Karina and Kirsten will talk a bit more about the books, but I wanted to just highlight three aspects really about Wits Press over the last 100 years. The first was, which is really interesting because the university obviously was focused very much on local research, but from the beginning, they were thinking about their audience and they were thinking about getting books out into the international market. International in those days meant mainly the UK, but then especially after World War II, North America. I mean, I think the the books traveled in other ways as well. The first book that was published was done together with Longmans Green in the UK, not because we need, or the press needed a co-publisher, but for the distribution. The second thing that is like a thread through the archive is constant concerns around funding. How would publications be funded? Where was the money coming from? So, for example, the first book came out of the, oh, no, I've forgotten the name. It was called something like a Native Labor Commission, because it was directly related to mining, which is what the commission was focused on the national resources. But this is a thread that carries on. And in fact, today, if anyone's published, they know when some manuscripts are submitted, Rorschach will start talking about what money they can bring. Because, yeah, we're a mission publisher. We are not a business entity in that way. And the university's always been very strict about money with the press. So it feels at times reading the archive, the press has to ask for money, go to their parent. They treat it sometimes in a very stern way, like a naughty child, and then, okay, but we'll give you something and you can, you know, and so on. And the press scrabbled and looked around, trying to do things in innovative ways. The third thing I thought I'd just mention is staffing at Wits Press. So the first publications officer, as it was called, was actually the librarian of Wits, who was working at the press only in a very part-time capacity. His name was Mr. Freer, and he constantly threatened to resign because he couldn't cope with the workload. So there's a very interesting letter here from 1944, where he writes to the registrar, and he says, I consider the whole position unsatisfactory from the point of view of book production, distribution, and staff. Although the essentials of good book production form part of a librarian's syllabus of training, the approach is different from that of the specialists. He says the output of its Witwatersrand University Press, which was the formal name, publications, is constantly growing, with the result that the time left for the fulfillment of my proper duties as librarian is correspondingly decreasing. If I'm also to discharge duties outside my terms of employment, then some relief is imperative. And then he says something quite funny. He says, not one of the 3 senior typists who has handled publications has liked them. I suspect such work appeals only to those initiated into the mysteries of bibliography. So the university rejected his offer to resign at that point. And then in the background, there were lots of very industrious women in particular. And of course, women working in the university at the time, they earned less money. Some of them had been academics, but if you were a woman academic and became a lecturer, you actually lost your academic appointment. So married women were not allowed to be academics. And this was not only a Wits thing, I think it came also from the UK. I think it was practiced at Oxford University, for example, and so on. So to the students who are here, I mean, I think there's something about working at a publisher that really suits women, and I see mainly women here, the multitasking or whatever it is, I don't know, but you know, there are a lot of sort of faceless people that have made a big contribution to the press and to the publishing since the early days. So I'm not going to say much more. I mean, I think that various things will come up in presentations today. But just to say this trend of Wits being a mission publisher, of the link to Wits University, of this idea of publishing local research and getting it out into the world. And nowadays, of course, we conceive of the world differently in a much broader way, something that started early on and that has continued. And if we look at the books, which I think will become clear out of Karina and Kirsten's presentation later, they really provide a snapshot of research that has been done in South Africa. Of course, not all the research, but you know, a cross-section of it. And I think that's very interesting. So thanks again for inviting us to contribute to this conference. Thanks.
I think this is the very scary part for me. I've admired Prof Hofmeyr for many years. And in the very first meeting that we had about this conference, we were discussing potential keynotes. And I mentioned, well, I am at Wits now. And so is Prof Hofmeyr. And immediately Prof LaRue and Prof Davies both said, well, if we can get her. And we did. And she has agreed to be here with us today. And I'm very honored to introduce her. I don't think she remembers the first time that she met me. It was, I think, the second or third conference of this kind that I organized at UP. And I kind of flagged her down outside of the venue, and she just released Gandhi's Printing Press and Experiment in Slow Reading. And I flagged her down outside, and I had no words to describe the experience of meeting a book historian who could bring such color and richness to the stories that she writes. And it opened my eyes to a whole new way of looking at how we read stories and the stories that we tell about our storytelling. And I could say none of those things. I was just completely dumbstruck. And I said, Prof Hofmeyr, I so admire your work. And she very modestly, humbly kind of said, oh, you know, I just research things that I find interesting. And that has had such a big impact on me and on my career. Yeah, and like I said, I think yesterday's panel showed, and research in book history shows, that it is the stories that we can tell about our storytelling that really helps us understand the value of print culture and of history. So I'm going to read from my own very well-worn copy of Dockside Reading, Hydrocolonialism and the Custom House, which I very much recommend, where Prof Hofmeyr specifically cautions against this when she says, sorry, let me just find the correct page here. Book historians follow similar detexting methods, tracing practices of not, non, and half or semi-reading, recycling the book as paper, presenting it as a calling card, more discussed than read, or trying to sidestep the laborious nature of reading by speeding it up. And I feel like this also came out in the panel on Noni Jabavu, where Dr. Kaba said that book history and the history that she gets about books can be very dry, being more of the measurements and the construction of the book and the actual story itself. So in my opinion, the craft of Prof Hofmeyr's writing is in bringing these stories to life. And my notes here just say customs, exclamation mark, because as someone who has read through hundreds of pages of customs documents, it really is a talent to make that interesting and enjoyable to read. And in this book, Prof Hofmeyr discusses George Rutherford with his very particular requirements of the customs house, who was the collector of customs right at the beginning of the Natal harbor. And then also in following readers, for instance, in coming into the harbor, sorting through their books, trying to decide when it was printed, where it was printed, does this count and does this not count? Prof Hofmeyr is able to bring the richness of reading and the experience of reading into reading about reading and reading about books. So in my novice opinion, Prof Hofmeyr humanizes book history in a way that is very difficult and that I have found very little other evidence of, telling a story about how we read stories. So in exploring this context of the book in its context and in the environment that it is read in, she also has turned now to looking at environmental studies and to read again. just find my page, there we go. Hydrocolonialism takes a different track, putting water and paper closer together, immersing printed matter in the elemental politics of the colonial port city. The burgeoning field of elemental media studies proves a useful framework for this purpose. As Nicole Starolewski indicates, all media becomes environmental media, and all media studies becomes environmental media studies. While Derek McCormack argues us to face the continuities between entities and the elemental conditions in which these entities are immersed and in which they participate. As John Durham Peter suggests, the elements themselves have come to be understood as infrastructures of being and agencies of order. And in this very burgeoning and developing field of environmental studies is where Prof Hofmeyr has situated her research now, and where she will, I believe, hopefully, continue her research at WISER at Wits University from next year. So I would like to welcome Prof Isabel Hofmeyr to speak on her book, Dockside Reading, and her talk is entitled Book History and the Environment. Thanks so much.
Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay, so firstly, Letitia, thank you for that very generous and lovely introduction. My thanks as well very much to Beth and Caroline for their invitation, also for building and sustaining this wonderful network. And then thanks to Letitia and Annika for the amazing work that you've done to bring everybody together. I'm always very delighted to be amongst print culture people and book historians. So as Letitia was saying, my talk today is trying to put together two things. So namely printed matter and the environment. So the reason obviously for attempting this is of course the mounting climate crisis, which is and will be gaining frightening momentum, exacerbated in South Africa by growing levels of stark inequality. And I think one function of humanities scholarship has always been to respond to the most pressing issues of the day and to mediate those and help students to think about them in a variety of ways. So while studies of print culture in South Africa have been diverse and rich, they have not as yet I think, fully responded to questions of climate change and the Anthropocene. Studies of print culture hence remain dry, certainly not in the sense of boring, but in the sense that the contexts for their studies remain land-based and human-focused. So I think looking 5 or 10 years ahead, when I think we will be really all absolutely engulfed by climate change, my concern then is to try and look to the future and to think what kind of routes one might take as a humanities scholar to try and address this challenge. But of course, you might well wonder how might one undertake such a task, since in order to fulfill its function, printed matter has to remain dry. Okay, so in this talk, I'll attempt to answer this question in 3 steps. I'll first talk about the book, Dockside Reading, Hydrocolonialism in the Custom House, produced the South African edition by Wits University Press. And then secondly, I'll foreground a theme from the book, namely, and again, as Letitia was just reading an extract, how elements have been instrumentalized for political ends and what this means for books. So that's the second bit. And then I'll talk a bit in the third step about the current project I'm working on called Elemental Reading, which tries to think about books in the elements. So books that are drowned, books that are burned, books that are buried, and books that are affected by the atmosphere. And I'll touch on archives along the way and at the end. Okay, so let's turn then to Dockside Reading. And very briefly, this book is located in the Custom House of the colonial port city. And this is the node through which much printed matter coming from outside had to be funneled. So here customs officials checked to see that this material was not pirated, seditious, or obscene. And so customs hence became the part of the colonial state that oversaw both copyright and censorship. So this project, in fact, took shape some years back in the wake of my previous book, Gandhi's Printing Press, Experiments in Slow Reading, which explored Gandhi's newspaper and printing endeavors during his South African sojourn. So one minor theme of the book was Gandhi's steadfast opposition to copyright, which he regarded as a form of private property. So having completed the book, I wanted to investigate this thread further. Was Gandhi's position unusual or not? What was the situation with regard to colonial copyright? So rather surprisingly, the search led me to the dockside and the custom house, since, as I discovered, it was this department that had overseen copyright. So I sought out the customs archive in South Africa with some trepidation, expecting dry and tedious reports on taxation and tariffs. Instead, I found an absolutely fascinating archive teeming with objects, in some cases actual ones like swatches of fabric, labels of tin condensed milk, packets of seeds. The documents themselves were filled with arguments about what these items actually were. Was a substance butter or margarine? Was there a difference between tea and medicinal herbs? Was a young pilchard the same as a sardine? So the custom house was in fact far more intriguing than I had anticipated. Had I done this project, I think 10 or 15 years ago, I would no doubt have written a drier book focusing only on the print culture implications of copyright and censorship without considering the coastal location of the custom house. While Gandhi's printing press had situated itself in the field of Indian Ocean studies, like much scholarship on the maritime world, there was not much actual sea involved. Instead, the ocean featured as a backdrop for human movement at sea, more surface than volumetric depth. So over the last decade, of course, rising sea levels and climate catastrophe have impacted powerfully on oceanic studies itself, which now grapples with how to go below the waterline and to engage with the materialities and ecologies of the marine world. So dockside reading then is an attempt to embed print culture in this new oceanic studies and to put water and paper closer together. So the book tracks printed matter from ship to shore and then through the regulatory regimes of the custom house. The setting is late 19th and early 20th century Southern Africa with glimpses towards other parts of the British Empire. And the study really traces how customs dockside protocols shaped understandings of copyright and censorship. So let me just explain that briefly. So in relation to copyright, I argue that the protocols that took shape around cargo were then applied to books, and that this shaped understandings of copyright. So with regard to these protocols, these basically involved customs officials reading the outside or the exoskeleton for a series of logistical marks and inscriptions, indicating where the cargo had come from, where it was headed, with instructions for transport and storage. So a modern day equivalent is a sign on a box that says "this way up." Okay, it's a logistical sign on the exoskeleton of the object for how it should be handled. So on the dockside, these signs and inscriptions were cross-checked with manifests, documents, invoices, and so on. So in most cases, cargo passed through without a problem and its covering remained intact. But if the consignment was suspicious in some way, then it had to be opened. So in the case of books, customs officials then read the book as if it was cargo, treating its outer signs like title, copyright, and place of manufacture as logistical signs, of where this book had come from and where it should or shouldn't go. So in these procedures, their hands were strengthened by a piece of legislation called the Merchandise Marks Act of the 1880s, which specified that all objects in the British Empire should carry a thing called a mark of origin, made in England, made in Australia, made in Canada. The legislation importantly also indicated that copyright could be considered, and I quote, as an indirect sign of manufacture. Okay, so that copyright then was treated as a logistical sign. Okay, so these procedures and protocols unfolded also on a colonial maritime frontier, which policed the global color line that sought to exclude certain categories of people while admitting others. So in this context, British copyright became treated as a sign that the book had been made in the metropolis and was hence somehow respectable, implicitly white, and safe to admit. So colonial copyright, in addition to being construed as this logistical inscription, also functioned as a kind of racial trademark. So if you're interested in debates on copyright, most contemporary debates on copyright based on the Euro-American world are focused on the rights of the author, and the copyright is seen as a mechanism then for creating legal personality. So dockside reading shows a very different understanding of copyright, where the author did not figure at all, and instead copyright is shaped by these dockside protocols on a colonial maritime frontier. So I'm interested then in how copyright changes as it travels into different contexts, and rather than being some sort of universal legal instrument, which is, I think, of how people often see it, I'm interested in how it's changed by the circumstances into which it travels. And then just as an aside, the book does look at copyright beyond the dockside and focuses briefly on African writers who were generally very, very keen users of copyright, since it was one way in which one could claim a right and constitute oneself as a rights-bearing subject. So as regards censorship, moving on to that, material was not read so much as treated like other forms of cargo, scanned for markings and sampled for traces of offensive material. So tax collectors at heart, customs officials were not keen readers. Instead, when dealing with a suspicious book, they applied the same techniques they did to other suspect cargo. They sampled, they counted, they measured, they touched, they sniffed, as you would tea. And rather than reading them, they assayed books. Books were hence routinely judged by their covers, their language or script. So in the British Empire, French was generally suspect, and non-Roman script was generally a sign that the book was somehow dangerous. Inspectors focused then very much on outward metadata, title, copyright, publisher, rather than content. And like other suspect cargo, objectionable books came to be seen as potential vectors of contamination. So the book suggests it's an epidemiological way of reading, where the book is imagined as a sort of cloud of pathogens. So dockside reading explores these practices, and it attempts really, I think, to extend our understandings of censorship itself. Most views of censorship, I think, look very high up the chain and look at official committees, and they assume that censors read everything that is placed in front of them. A view from the Custom House takes us much lower down the chain, showing a rather different mode of reading based on sampling and counting. So the reading methods of the Customs House, I think, were also to feed into subsequent apartheid censorship practices, which in part drew on the methods used by customs inspectors while departing from them. And that was very much an area that Letitia's presentation yesterday dealt with. Just as a bit of an aside, the book also is interested in print culture as part of the infrastructure of the port itself. So the raison d'etre of any port is to transfer goods and passengers from ship to shore, and its infrastructure serves these purposes, whether it's submarine engineering, land reclamation platforms, dock and port installations, and so on. So documents then, like forms and manifests, are part of these infrastructural processes, and the book argues that we can think about them as a type of textual landfill or land reclamation. So one apt example is the ubiquitous Settler Handbook, which included advice on how and when to travel, what to bring, what to expect. And it often included arrival and customs forms and formalities. So this combination of the Settler Handbook with these customs and arrival forms acted in concert with the port infrastructure and its land reclamation, which quite literally reached out to incoming passengers of the right class and race, giving them their first purchase on the colony. So as part of the infrastructure, these handbooks aimed to give incoming settlers a dry landing and to make them landed, which was a phrase of port city governance, which meant both to be physically landed on shore, but also to be legally admitted, as in the phrase landed immigrant, meaning somebody legally and permanently admitted. So the book also is interested then in sort of to think about these questions in literary terms. And it argues that this handbook as a genre of the dockside can usefully be inserted into discussions of South African literature. And I argue that the genre stands midway between two key colonial narrative modes, the story of the shipwreck and the farm novel. So while promoting the romance of maritime manliness, the shipwreck narrative simultaneously bore testimony to the uncertainty of the imperial venture itself. So as Michael Teitelstadt's work indicated, and as he spoke yesterday, shipwrecks and the stories about them called port and harbor development into being as a way of trying to obviate further disasters at sea. So in some instances, actual shipwrecks close to the coast were used as the basis for land reclamation, the submarine remains being filled with stones to create a foothold for artificially extending coastal terrain. So the port and its infrastructure then sought to overwrite the shipwreck narrative. And as part of this infrastructure, the genres of the dockside, like the customs manual and the settler handbook, played their part, creating a kind of textual landfill to enable settlers to become landed and to gain traction on the colony. The institution through which many settlers ultimately achieved this aim was the farm. And as James Coetzee has famously argued, the farm novel in turn became an important intellectual instrument of land possession and dispossession. So, this tries to put together thinking about South African literature through land and sea, and thinking about the genres of the dockside, linking the shipwreck narrative on the one hand and the farm novel on the other. Okay, so what about the elements? Okay, on to part two. One of the arguments that the book makes is that we need to think about the processes of copyright and censorship in the elemental politics of the port city. So customs inspectors dumped unclaimed, smuggled, or banned items into the ocean. So often they would row out 3 nautical miles to sea and dispose of these objects. So the ocean itself then functions as a medium or instrument of censorship. So put differently, we can say officials weaponized water in order to carry out this function of censorship. So as the process, also as we've seen this idea of landing or becoming landed, dry land also becomes instrumentalized as a symbol of colonial propriety and acceptance to certain categories of people. Okay, so again, both water and land are kind of instrumentalized and weaponized. So this process of weaponizing water has longer histories going both backwards and forwards. In the Dutch Empire, those convicted of sodomy were in some instances sentenced, quote, to be taken out to sea, thrown overboard and drowned. In the 20th century, the apartheid regime and also Pinochet's state in Chile routinely dumped the corpses of murdered political prisoners at sea. And also during the period of decolonization in the 50s and 60s, departing colonial regimes, especially in the Caribbean, regularly tipped in tons of incriminating documentation into the ocean. So you can see then the elements have long been recruited for a range of purposes. And my current project is really attempting to explore this proposition, investigating, as I've said, how books have been drowned, burned, buried, and affected by the atmosphere. And the object is to trace out these themes in empirical terms and to use this material to examine how this instrumentalization and weaponization of the elements has been used in, through, and around books. So it's trying to bring together book history and environmental history. So let me just give you some examples, and let me start with that which I know most about, and that is books that end up in the water, an occurrence that is more common than one might expect. In addition to dockside censors, there were in many other instances when books were cast into the water or ended up in the water. So the crew of storm-racked sailing ships turfed cargo to lighten the vessel. The heaviest items went first, and so consignments of books occasionally found themselves heaved into the ocean. Another less dramatic instance involved lazy sailors who had not kept up their logbooks and so conveniently let them slip overboard. In some instances, passengers approaching ports where pirated editions of copyrighted British work were prohibited also had to turf their volumes into the sea. In a more contemporary setting, with books being more plentiful, throwing volumes overboard can be a sign of leaving an old life behind. As Langston Hughes did, steaming out of New York Harbor in 1923 on a maiden voyage as a sailor, leaning over the rail of the SS Malone, he hurled the books, mostly acquired during 1 year of a science degree at Columbia, as far as he could. And he writes, "It was like throwing 1,000,000 bricks out of my heart." In Michel de Cretch's novel, Questions of Travel, Hester returns by ship to Sydney after a youthful and extended sojourn in London. And standing at the ship's rail in Colombo Harbour, she drops 11 volumes of her London diary one by one into the water. Books, some people have often asked me whether any, do bits of books survive underwater? And of course, paper generally doesn't, except in very rare instances. And so one recent case emerged from marine archaeological work on a shipwreck off North Carolina, which turned up 16 tiny fragments of paper found in the sludge of a cannon. So the vessel in question was the Queen Anne's Revenge, the flagship of Blackbeard, the famed pirate, which ran aground in 1718. So the fragments, in fact, proved to be legible and turned out to be a page from the 1712 first edition of a book by Captain Edward Cook called A Voyage to the South Sea. So let me just, in moving towards a conclusion, talk briefly then about the other categories of fire, earth, and air. I've only just started to explore these, so I can do no more than give you some quick examples. And as is the mode now, if you've got, I'm always seeking I'm crowdfunding examples. So if anybody can think of anything, I'd be most grateful. So book burning has, of course, been widely and extensively studied in many different settings. And thanks to Archie Dick's work, we now have insight into how banned books were routinely incinerated in South Africa. In a slightly different context, the apartheid state in its dying day ordered the destruction of, again, tons of incriminating material, and bonfires burned for days on end. Themes of fire are, of course, strong in anti-apartheid movements, past burning being one obvious example. And more recently, the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall also weaponized fire burning artworks, books, and in one instance, a law library. So through, I think, these kinds of examples, I'm interested to trace how burning of books and documents becomes an important mode of a kind of political symbolism. So with regard to buried books, the two sort of obvious examples that I can think of thus far are the South African or the Anglo-Boer War, as Kitchener's scorched earth policy took hold, many valuable objects, including books, were buried. The other example I've learned from Rachel Mattau's work involved anti-apartheid activists who had to hide material that might be considered subversive. And, obviously one option was to bury them. I think so for book historians, one of the interesting questions then remains how these buried books are remembered. Does a book that might be disfigured through burial become more or less precious? Does it become a kind of a reliquary, a domestic site of memory and history? Finally, let me just talk a little bit about books in the atmosphere. And here I've been trying to explore this idea through archives. And archives, of course, aim to be these controlled environments which aim for a constant temperature, and obviously they must strive to keep insects out. So air and insects hence become objects of governance, okay, both in the archive but also for the larger state. So one example I'm currently following is the progress of a thing called the paste beetle through the Cape archives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, as I say, around the turn of the century, this creature ate its way through the births, deaths, and marriage records, in addition to a range of other collections. These insects, of course, were, obviously of some alarm both to the archivists, but also because they were damaging the material substance of the state itself. So as Rohan Deb Roy has argued in relation to white ants in India, and I quote, insects were ubiquitous and fundamental to the shaping of British colonial power. British rule in India was vulnerable to white ants because these insects consumed paper and wood, the key material foundations of the colonial state. The white ant problem also made the colonial state more resilient and intrusive. The sphere of strict governmental intervention was extended to include both animate and inanimate non-humans, while these insects were invoked as symbols to characterize colonized landscapes, peoples, and cultures, and close quote. So with regard to the paste beetle, I can just say the archivist at the time was a man called Louis Perringuet, who was also an entomologist. And as Siraj Rasool and Martin Legasic's work has shown, Perringuet was also extensively involved in collecting Khoisan skeletons, for science. And this process depended on extensive grave robbery and the forcible removal of remains. So I'm interested then to take these questions of control and fumigation of insects, to think about it then as part of these processes, the fairly violent processes of colonial science and colonial state formation. So in exploring books through the elements, I also wanted to return to a really rather old-fashioned aspect of book history, which was mentioned by Veronica, I think, namely bibliography, okay? The description of various parts of the book and its histories, how did this part of the book come to be like this? So for example, there are a lot of histories of the title page. Manuscripts, of course, didn't have title pages, but the title page emerges apparently in the first 50 years of printing. There's a lot of interesting work on how and why this happens. So I'm interested then about, could one think about ecological histories of the title page? So one line of argument, I think, could be that insects tend to favor title pages, or rather, they tend to favor the outer edges of a book, which they treat like a habitat similar to a log. So if you think about a log, the insects will occupy the outer edges of the log. Also, of course, most protein is in a book is concentrated around the edges, the glue, the leather binding, etc. Okay, so that's sort of one of the reasons, one of the directions in which I'm trying to think. And so then just thinking about books from the point of view of insects, I think changes one's perspective quite radically. For them, libraries and archives are really evolutionary opportunities. Thank you.
I think we have time for questions. If there are any questions for Prof Hofmeyr. I was wondering if you could speak briefly in your book.